Okay, graphic design. Let's get into our part 2 of color theory specifically for graphic design. And just to recap, we have a little reference of popular color harmonies or ones that we know are almost guaranteed to work, and that's these 6. So as you're building color schemes, going back to these 6 harmonies and thinking about how you can build off these is really your best way to start. But to think a little bit more about color, you want to think about how all color is relative, how there's a psychology of color, and what is equitable color design, and lastly, how different cultures interpret colors. So the first component, which is color, is all relative. Just like everything is relative, so is color. So unless you have one hue with black and white, which is a monochrome color scheme, unless you have that, your colors will all have to work with a lot of other variables. Specifically, you'll have to compare hue to hue. So here we have a blue hue with another hue of blue. That's analogous color scheme. And here we have blue with almost its opposite. Blue's opposite is actually orange. This is kind of an orange yellow. And you can see here the contrast is much stronger and bold on the right hand side. Here it's much a softer contrast. This actually almost makes the blue in the center look a little more purple because those two blues end up canceling each other out. And you'll also want to compare value of different color. Here we have another analogous color harmony with another complementary color harmony in both in comparison. But it's important to think about the values that you're contrasting. Here we have similar color family, similar hue, but we have dark versus light. And here we have light versus dark. So the same square is going to look light or dark depending on what's surrounding it. And then lastly, down here, this one little lime square is almost impossible to see when it's next to its similar saturation, which is this other purple around it. So it's analogous, but also a similar saturation. Here, much different on the saturation scale. We have a much lighter version, and then we have a much darker version. So this has a nice contrast because it's both color complementary contrast and a saturation contrast. And then whenever you're trying to think about how things are looking, converting them to black and white can be really helpful because even though colors can look good when they're not in contrast, a strong contrast is often a better design. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about equity. So psychology of color. This is a lot of subjective thoughts. This is not really anything that's made in stone or scientifically proven. But for the Western world, we do have mainly these kind of associations with these colors. So as you're designing something for different moods, different vibes, different audiences, this can be a good reference to have. And when you start looking at logos, if you start actually comparing logos and what that company represent, like a bank or a recycling plant or a clothing brand, you can really start seeing that they usually often match up pretty well with this little chart. I thought this was just kind of fun. This is psychology of color Disney characters. And you get to see how they divide up the hues and what they say those hues mean, and then also which characters fall within those hues. And then if you have time, this one little video from Khan Academy is really nice if you have not yet seen it. It talks about color, talks about a little bit about color and how it's used in their films and how they associate different colors with different characters, how Ellie is magenta and how her husband is more of blue, more of brown, and just how they tell a story with color in addition to with their characters. Now, a little bit about equity. We have about 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women who are colorblind, and that's worldwide. And there's different kinds of color blindness. But it's important to think about this audience because that's 1 in 12 and 1 in 200 might seem like a small number, but statistically they're very actually high. So that means that in our school alone, when you're designing posters, we have that many people who would be sensitive to color relationships. And here you can kind of see, because I actually don't know, none of you have mentioned being colorblind. So if you are, you might struggle with some of these letters or some of these numbers. But here, in case you are not colorblind, you get to see a little comparison of what someone with a red-green colorblind, what they would see. There's 3 different kinds of color blindness. So there's the red-green, but there's also two others. So if this is the normal spectrum of color, then this is what the protan color blindness will see. This is what Durtran will see. This is what Tritan will see. And when you're designing color palettes, you have websites that'll offer colorblind sensitive color palettes. It can be a good resource, especially for making charts and graphs. But a couple things to think about when you're designing is that there's certain color harmonies or color relationships that are very hard to see. And they're listed here on the left. So if these can be avoided, that can be very helpful for colorblind audiences. However, if they can't be avoided, there's a few other things you can do to try and work around this. You can communicate with colors and symbols, so that way someone's not relying on just a color to communicate an idea. And if you use value contrast, most people with a colorblind deficiency can see high contrast. And then you can also think of other ways to demonstrate differences, like line thickness and patterns and textures, especially again if you're making graphs. And you can also try a monochrome design, because if it's a monochrome design, whatever family it's in, it won't be contrasting with another hue. Now lastly, this is not a vetted graph, but it is one that I've seen in more than one location. And this is an idea of how your basic colors read to different cultures, and like giant cultures, obviously. There's always going to be exceptions to this. But one specifically is that I know with purple, purple was one of the hardest dyes to get in Europe, and it was therefore really only used by royalty because they had the ability to buy that dye. And therefore, in the Western culture, we often associate purple with royalty because that dye was so hard to get. And in America, also, you might see a lot of the founding fathers wearing black. Now, you might think black looks kind of bland compared to purple, and that is true. However, you'll see a lot of founding fathers wearing black, partly because black dye was also very expensive in America. So if you had black dye, if you could afford that much color into your wool, that was also a sign of prominence and a sign of being in the upper class. So it's a little bit of how colors can read across different cultures. So some things to keep in mind as you design and as you definitely move forward in any graphic design you do in college.